Oh, ooh, ooh. Devin, this is one of our better ideas. Ivan, say something.
Hello, hello.
Oh,
Uh-oh, what happened?
yes. I'm being told to
It's
go.
working? All right, so are we good? You just kind of disappeared.
Yes, we're good. We're good.
Okay,
Goodbye.
okay, okay. All right. All right, well, hi again, guys. I guess not everybody that is actually there physically present could hear me, so just want to thank you again for inviting me to thank you to Tally and to Jessica and to everyone. So it's very exciting to be here. I love talking about the desert. I grew up in the desert for a few years when I was a kid. It had a strong influence on me, and I've just been fascinated by these environments ever since. And, actually, as I was looking at this map of the deserts of the world just today, I realized that the only deserts I've ever visited have been those in North America. There are quite a few others around, and we'll look at a map in a moment. But despite all my travels, I still haven't seen any of the other deserts, and despite my love of deserts. So, anyway, sounds like I've got some trips that I need to plan. So, hopefully, you will find this interesting. So, let me go ahead and pull this up here. So, just to confirm, yeah, it looks like you guys probably see what I'm seeing, which is the little slide there on the left. So, let's talk about birds and the desert. Here we go. Come over here.
We can only see Jessica's screen and a little picture of you.
Oh, okay. That's not good.
I thought that I did hit record. Yeah, I'm recording.
You're
Okay.
recording, but we're seeing your bird and the cactus.
Jessica, if you can spotlight me, I think that's the way to make it so that everybody sees my screen like full screen. Yeah, let's see. Did that work?
That is.
No, all we're seeing is a small thumbnail of Ivan.
Small thumbnail.
I see a big picture of a blue grosbeak on it, like a
Yeah, that's
some kind of a
that's not.
cactus. That's all I see besides you.
That's strange. I have it sharing whatever is on my screen.
Yeah, so and am I full screen on your screen?
Well, on my screen, it looks good, and that's what I thought everybody could see.
Oh. Yeah, that's weird.
I don't know what these buttons do, Mary.
Yeah, I guess yeah, I thought the spotlighting would solve it, but I guess if folks, because I think people on their end can have various views, they can choose different views, and if they don't choose the right view, then they don't get the full screen. The other thing, I could share my screen, but there might be a delay with the audio if I do that.
I mean, I'm changing.
I'm on Zoom and it's working great.
Okay, so that sounds
Do you see
good.
are you seeing the grosbeak on the cactus?
That's what I see.
Yeah, but that's not the picture.
That's not what we're supposed
I mean,
to
I
see.
can see what you had up earlier, the desert birds, but you are only in the speaker little box, not the
Right.
actual big screen.
There are a lot of people talking right now.
Actually, Jessica, are you sharing your screen still?
Yes.
That I think that's the problem.
So
Stop sharing your screen.
Oh, wait, I know where that is.
There we go. Now it's working.
It's different every month, y'all.
Yay!
Hey.
Yeah, I know. We've been doing this for years now, and it's always a challenge for me too. So thank you. Thanks for your patience, everyone. All right, let's go ahead and get into it. All right, so deserts, right? Let's start off with just a little journey to the Atacama Desert. You've probably heard of this place. It is one of, if not the most dry places on the planet, at least outside of the poles. The Atacama, which is in South America, and I'll show you a map in a moment, gets only about, on average, maybe less than an inch of rain per year, maybe 15 millimeters. half an inch, something like that. So maybe where you're at there in Colorado, you might be, I don't know, maybe what, 20, 25 inches of rain, maybe. We get 40 plus here in Oregon. So not a lot of moisture. So here's the Atacama. We're going to zoom in South America. And it is in the rain shadow of the Andes. So you get all that moisture coming across from the Amazon and it gets blocked. And you have this incredibly dry desert. In some places, there's almost no life, like no vegetation, hardly anything going on. It's really quite amazing. And so we're going to look at one particular eBird hotspot in the Atacama. We're zooming in on it, okay? So this is a satellite image, and here is the hotspot itself. It's kind of hard to believe that this even exists, but this is called Altos de Pica, and believe it or not, there are some birds there. There's a dry wash. There's a road that goes through there. So I guess folks have seen at least a few birds, because I went to eBird and I pulled off some of the species that have been seen there. There aren't that many observations and there haven't been many checklists submitted, but there's a fair list of interesting birds there. And I just want to highlight one, and that is the grayish miner. And this bird is just a drab little bugger, Geocytta maritima. It's in the Furnariidae family, the ovenbird family. Doesn't look like much, but this bird is amazing because it lives in the Atacama, and it lives in some of the most desolate habitats within the Atacama, where there's basically no vegetation. It's hard to imagine how this bird survives there. Biologists don't actually know what this bird eats. They don't know much about its natural history because nobody really wants to go down there and spend weeks or months studying this bird to get the answers. So the grayish miner goes about its business in this almost Mars-like environment, apparently thriving, which is really remarkable. So to me, this kind of phenomenon, I think, is just fascinating as a biologist. I just love this kind of thing. So the question is, why are we here? Why are we talking about desert birds tonight? What's so interesting about them? We've got, the thing about the desert is it's so harsh. And I mentioned that it's parts, some of them can be like alien planets, right? Like Mars. They're so dry, so inhospitable to life as we typically imagine it, that it's almost like we're visiting another planet sometimes. And the life forms you see in the desert can be so wild looking and strange and prickly and venomous and weird. With respect to birds, there aren't a lot of species, so the desert doesn't have a high diversity of species typically, and that goes for pretty much every other type of organism. But the ones that you do find there, I would argue, can be quite interesting or even fascinating. Really cool birds like, of course, the roadrunner there in the upper right. And we've got the Mongolian ground jay in the lower right. Lower left is a desert owl, and in the upper left is a dune lark. So the desert is so harsh that it's like a crucible for evolution. Only the toughest birds survive, and what comes out the other end after many, many generations, after millions of years, are these weird and wonderful and resilient birds. So just to reiterate, we've got this harsh environment, very like an alien world. The birds that are there are tough and resilient. They're interesting. And it's because there are these severe natural selection pressures from evolution that drives this whole thing. And the birds that are there made it through all that somehow. So we're talking about deserts. Let's make sure we're on the same page about what a desert is. So we all have a concept of what a desert is. It looks like this, right? It's got some cactus in it, probably got some sand dunes, maybe some camels walking around. There you go. That's a desert. So we have ideas about what the desert looks like, and there are these icons of the desert. But because there are different deserts around the world and they have evolved independently, they have wildly different vegetation and animals and birds. So what is it that unites deserts? What makes them all similar in terms of their environment? Ecologists would say that generally, as a rule of thumb, we imagine a desert as a place that gets less than 10 inches of rain per year, or 25 centimeters. So that is, again, just a rule of thumb. This is a gradient. Deserts can blend into grasslands and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of nuances here. We're just trying to do the real broad strokes. But really importantly, besides the rainfall being low, it's important that the evaporation, the loss of water, greatly exceeds the amount of annual precipitation, because that's key. Because if the moisture, even if it was a small amount, stayed there in place, you might not have a desert. But it's because that water that moisture is escaping. It's being returned to the air, and that's what makes a desert. So really, you want to think of it like this, where precipitation is a lot less than evaporation, or evaporation is a lot more than precipitation. That's the equation to give you a full-on desert. All right, so now I'm going to switch over to another view here. And let's see, looks like maybe that worked. So now we're looking at a map of all of the deserts of the world. So these conditions come together in interesting ways to create deserts. And so we, of course, have our North American deserts, and we'll talk more about those a little bit in a moment. And then we have South American deserts like the Atacama, African deserts, of course, the Sahara being perhaps the most famous. And in the south, you have the Kalahari and the Namib Desert. And then you have the Asian deserts. So those of the Arabian Peninsula, Western Asia, Central Asia, like the Gobi Desert of Mongolia and China. And then you have, of course, the deserts of Australia. Australia is a famously arid continent. And the reasons deserts are where they are, that there's a lot of interesting factors at play. We don't have probably time to get into all of that, but it has to do with high pressure systems that tend to occur within the latitudes of 15 to 35 degrees north and south of the equator, very roughly. And that causes high pressure. That dries things out, warms things up. But there are other factors involved, like wind patterns, the prevailing winds, the currents, ocean currents actually can have a strong effect. And there's just a lot going on. Mountain ranges, rain shadows. You probably know a lot of this from your understanding of ecology and biology, but it's always just fun to review. So deserts actually cover about 33% of the world's surface. Now, it depends on how you define deserts. Ecologists sometimes disagree, but basically a third of the world's surface is covered by desert, and that's pretty cool. Lots of interesting environments out there. Okay, switching back to this view here. So I should mention that the poles have deserts as well. This is not how we typically think of the desert, but Antarctica, by and large, is basically one massive, really, really cold desert. And it's because of those same conditions, because precipitation is very low and evaporation is higher because of the wind and things. But really, it's just so cold that even though there's very, very little precipitation, it all just gets locked up in ice. And we might think that, oh, there's a lot of snow and ice, so that's a lot of precipitation, but that has accumulated over millions of years, and it's really, again, like an alien world. So today we're not really talking about the polar deserts, but just, if you want to have a fun cocktail party factoid to pull out, you can tell people, Antarctica is actually a desert, technically. So people love that kind of stuff. All right, so very quickly, let's just take a look at some birds at these various regional deserts around the world. So looking first at South America, we have in the upper left an oasis hummingbird. I'll talk a little more about that species later. But the name, you can imagine that has something to do with the desert. Then we have the bare-faced ground dove in the upper right. In the lower left, we have slender-billed finch, which is not in the true finch family. It's actually in the tanager family. This is South America. And then we have the lesser rhea, a large flightless bird. And all of these birds are really good at surviving in arid environments. But one of the take-home messages here is that true desert birds, obligate desert birds, species that only live in the desert, are pretty rare. There aren't that many of those among the 11,000 plus species on the planet. Many other birds, like some of these and some of the ones I'll be showing you, are adapted to pretty dry conditions, and they're tough buggers, but they may spend part of their life cycle elsewhere outside of the desert, or they may live on the fringes of the desert or in pockets of mild habitat within the desert, like an oasis. So birds that are true desert species, like the grayish miner, are actually kind of rare. Just kind of interesting to think about. So when you look at those eBird lists, you might see many species in the desert, but those aren't necessarily desert birds, if you know what I mean. So moving over to Africa, we have another example of species. We have the desert sparrow in the upper left, and that was the species that I opened up the talk with, the little guy that was sitting in the sand dunes. This is a handsome little cousin to the house sparrow that we all know quite well. So it's in the Old World sparrow family. There's the brown-necked raven in the upper right. This bird is widespread across the Sahara, as well as the desert sparrow. And in the lower left, we have the greater hoopoe lark. So it is a true lark in the lark family, and it's found across northern Africa as well as into the deserts of Western Asia. And in the lower right, we have the dune lark, and that is a bird that is found only in the Namib Desert in southern Africa. Moving over to Asia, really cool bird there. We have the Mongolian ground jay in the upper left. So this is a corvid, so it's a true jay, but these birds really are ground dwellers. They're running around on the ground. They're not flightless, but they forage on the ground. And there's a handful of ground jays. On the right, we have the Asian desert warbler. So not closely related to our warblers. It's in the Old World family Sylviidae, which is the Old World warblers. And in the lower left, we have desert finch. And then the last one there is the Eastern rock nuthatch. You could probably recognize that that's a nuthatch. So we're just moving along. Again, just wanted to give you kind of a gallery of some of these birds. And so far, you've noticed probably a pattern is that they're pretty drab on average. They're kind of sand colored, kind of brown, kind of buff, which makes sense. If they're living in a dry environment, that's going to provide camouflage. But we're getting to a colorful one here in a moment. So we've got the cinnamon quail thrush. This is Australia. Cinnamon quail thrush in the upper left. The chestnut-breasted whiteface on the right. Crimson chat on the lower left. Very beautiful, colorful bird. That's in the honeyeater family. And then the dusky grass wren on the lower right, which is related to the fairy wrens, if you've ever heard of those. So Australia, yeah, being a very dry country in general, has lots of birds that live in the desert there. But what's interesting about Australia is, at least what I find, is many of these species in Australia that are found deep in the desert are found widespread across the continent. Many of the species have these really broad ranges, and they just move through the desert, perhaps nomadically, but they aren't necessarily restricted to the desert. So things like some of the parrots and whatnot, they're found all over the place, including the desert. And then, of course, everybody's favorite continent, North America. And I'm sure you're intimately familiar with some of these birds. One of the best birds of all time, the roadrunner in the upper left, famous desert bird, really kind of a quintessential desert species, has many adaptations for living in the desert. And in the upper right, we have North America's, or at least the US's, only representative of the silky flycatcher family, the Phainopepla, with that bright red eye. And then in the lower left, we have, again, the only representative of the family Remizidae, and that is the verdin, the cute little verdin. And then on the lower right, we have the cactus wren. So I might have mixed up my left and rights there. I do that, so hopefully you're following along. Everybody knows the cactus wren, state bird of Arizona, really charismatic species. So, and we have many more, of course. There's the Pyrrholoxia and Gambel's quail and all kinds of good stuff. So long list of great North American desert birds. So let's look at North America. So we've got 4 deserts on our continent, and they all kind of intergrade with each other. They're contiguous, which is really interesting. So they have different variables that come together that define these different environments in terms of temperature and precipitation. And those then dictate what kinds of plants can grow in those environments. And of course, what kinds of plants and insects, that determines what kind of birds live there. So we have the Great Basin, which is our cold desert. It's a relatively high latitude, cold, relatively high elevation, continental climate. So quite chilly in the winter, but also really hot in the summer. So a rough environment for any kind of life form. So it's probably our least diverse desert. And then we have the Mojave, which is our smallest desert in sort of eastern California, western Nevada. The Sonoran, which has the most diversity across the board in terms of plants and invertebrates and birds. It's kind of a subtropical desert, and it has the summer monsoon season, so it actually gets quite a bit of rain in the summers, which allows it to green up a bit. And then we have the Chihuahuan Desert, the largest and the fourth, which is largely in Mexico, but gets into western Texas and New Mexico. All right, so those are our deserts. And a lot of our desert birds are found across, they're not necessarily restricted to one desert or the other. There are some specialists, but Some of those birds can traverse the deserts. They're just generally arid adapted. Okay, so you're a bird and you find yourself in the desert. Your parents, hatched an egg in the desert and you're like, ah, dang it, this is where I have to survive. This is going to be tough. So what are the challenges for a bird or other vertebrate living in the desert? And these would be challenges that we would face as well. So as we all know, of course, it's often quite hot in the desert. Temperature is a real problem. Now, there are cold deserts, so-called cold deserts, even outside of the poles, but generally we think of high daytime temperatures, especially in the summer, as being a real problem. Some of the world's records for high temperatures were recorded in Death Valley, other places like the Middle East, incredibly hot temperatures, and yet sometimes there are birds in those environments. But a key thing to remember is the desert is a land of extreme temperatures. It's not necessarily just high temperature. In many places, it's also low temperature, like the Great Basin. So that's a problem there. Even the Atacama has some higher elevation areas that get really cold at night. Likewise, for even the Sahara, certainly the Gobi Desert is very cold, well below freezing in the winter. So these are just harsh environments almost any time of year. So they can be very difficult. And then, of course, the lack of water. And we talked about why that would be. There are different global forces that cause there to be low precipitation. And then you have the high temperatures and lots of solar radiation and wind causing lots of evaporation. So you have a desert. So lack of water is a real challenge if you're a bird. And then lack of food, because those things come together to create conditions where there are very few plants, very few seeds, very few invertebrates or small animals to eat. And so there's just not a lot of biomass to get recycled by birds or other vertebrates. So it's just a very limiting environment. The pantry is empty, essentially, or not quite empty, but it's pretty slim pickings. Okay, so temperature extremes, hot and cold, very limited water or lack of water, scarcity of food. Okay. So how do birds contend with these challenges? How have they? Now, when we look at desert birds, desert adapted birds, we're looking at the end result of millions of years of evolution. Natural selection has honed them to be able to survive. All the ones that weren't able to hack it, they're long gone. Their genes were removed. So when we think of adaptations, there are different kinds of adaptations. There are behavioral adaptations. There are physiological adaptations, so even at the cellular level or at the level of organs, tissues, things like that. And there are dietary adaptations, so what a particular bird might have evolved to be able to eat. So we can look at all kinds of interesting adaptations. But if we kind of look at a broad level, we can think about the ways that birds move, because of course, birds are highly mobile vertebrates. And those that can fly have the option of moving around, and maybe they just don't even need to be in the desert at all. So let's consider 4 different strategies here represented by these 4 species, okay? And I'll go through each of these individually. So we have first the desert lark, which is in the lark family, Alaudidae. This is a bird of northern Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and Western Asia. It's just a drab sand-colored bird, but it lives in some really deep desert environments. And so in terms of movement, sorry, just had to clear my... This species is resident. So it lives in the desert year round. That's what the purple color there is telling us. And so this bird is a true desert bird. It's an obligate desert bird. It's adapted to the harsh conditions there. So that bird doesn't really move. That's when we think about real desert birds, that's the kind of species we're thinking about. But again, other birds have interesting stories to tell. The desert wheat ear would be an example of a migrant. So if you look at the range map there in the lower left, you can see that this species is in the Sahara and the Arabian Peninsula during the winter, during the non-breeding season. And there are some resident populations, but it moves north. Many of them move north and east or to the northern Africa to breed, where conditions are much more agreeable. There's much more moisture, more food. And so that's how these birds deal with being in the desert. They're only there when conditions are relatively mild. When things get hot and uncomfortable, they get out of town. They head north, so where they can breed and raise their families. So that's a really, really valuable strategy that things like lizards can't do, you know, so birds have that ability is to migrate and leave the desert seasonally. And then we have nomadism. So remember earlier I mentioned that in Australia, many of the species are not necessarily restricted to the desert, and they have these really broad ranges. And that would be true of the budgerigar here, the famous pet store budgie. These little guys move all around Australia, and they're basically just following the resources. They're going where the food and the water are, because that can be very random in Australia throughout the year. There's just this kind of stochasticity or chaos to where those things are available. So the ability to fly in big flocks from one patch of resources to another is an amazing ability, and a lot of Australian birds do that. They're nomadic. And I mentioned the oasis hummingbird earlier, this cute little guy here. So this is a bird of the Atacama Desert. And if you look at its range map, it's right in there. But you have to look at the smaller scale, because it truly does live in these oases, in these environments that have much more water and vegetation locally. So they are, for example, found in riparian thickets right along streams and rivers that are coming out of the mountains. Maybe 10 feet away, 20 feet away, it's just sun-baked desert, but right by the margins of the stream, there are resources. There are flowers for these hummingbirds to feed from, insects that they can feed their chicks in the spring. So it's a desert bird. If you look at its range, it is, but it sort of escapes the challenges of the desert by living in these, I wouldn't say, not say really a microhabitat, but habitats that have a restricted distribution within the greater desert area. So they use these refugia, right? So something like a riparian thicket or an oasis would be a refugium, a refuge from the harsh conditions of the desert. Okay, so in terms of beating the heat, birds have these different adaptations, right? So that we talked about movement, so that's one way birds would deal with all this. And one thing to consider is that birds have higher body temperatures than we do on average. And if your body temperature is closer to the air temperature, there's not going to be as much heat transfer. So birds they can handle higher temperatures a little better than we can because of that. So that's just one thing right off the bat. They're just lucky that way. And then other things that birds do would be very similar to what you or I would do to avoid the challenges of the desert. They're active in the morning, really early when it's still cool, and there might even be a little moisture in the air. And they're also active in the evenings. So we might say they're crepuscular if they're really active at the sort of kind of early morning and at sunset. Or they might be nocturnal. That's another strategy. We have nocturnal birds, obviously owls being the most famous, but things like nighthawks and poor wills, some other birds. So if you're active at night, you beat a lot of, you don't have to deal with a lot of those conditions either. And then you can also seek shade during the day. A lot of birds do that during the hottest time of the day. Go hang out under a bush, under the edge of a cliff or a rock, and wait till evening. And then when it comes to breeding, many of these birds will nest either in cavities, in trees, or in crevices, or they'll dig burrows or use burrows from other animals. And so it's much cooler in those environments. And so for the chicks, because they're very vulnerable to high temperatures and sun and wind and all that, they have a better chance of survival in those protected areas. Okay, so now I'm going to switch over again. Let's see here. Right, so just to give a few examples of what I was just talking about. So you have this roadrunner here hanging out in the shade during the heat of the day, thermoregulating, keeping cool, which is great. And another way that many birds are able to keep cool is they essentially pant like a dog does. They do what is called gular fluttering. The gular skin of their throat, they kind of move in and out, and that allows air to pass over the moist tissues of their mouth, and it causes evaporation, and that carries heat away from their bodies. Same thing that's happening with a dog panting, very similar to what happens to us when we're sweating. Birds don't sweat, so this is one of the things that they can do to try to cool down a little bit. And obviously, you've seen it where, you've seen probably all kinds of birds on a really hot day panting, and you kind of feel sorry for the little guys because they're just doing whatever they can. They've got a down coat on and they're trying to cool off. And then, of course, we talked about nesting in burrows. So burrowing owls being the most famous example. And they use the burrows of other animals, but then they can also do some excavation on their own to make it their own. And then we have something like the little elf owl, which is the smallest owl in the world in the desert Southwest. These guys get into the nest cavities in things like saguaro cactuses. And so, as you can imagine, it's much cooler and a nicer environment in there, especially because the cactus actually is full of water, and that water is great as an insulator to keep the temperature relatively moderate inside. So really clever place to make your nest. Cactus wrens, they build their own nests, but they do build these globular dome-like nests, which are covered. So some of these birds, their strategy is if they're not nesting in a cavity or a burrow, they'll make sure that their nest has a roof over it to create some shade. And then this is a wonderful bird, the canyon wren. So this is a canyon wren's nest, and these guys will get tucked up under rocks and in rocky crevices. And rocks can retain a lot of coolness. They can provide these great little microhabitats of mild temperatures. So canyon wrens make use of all that. Okay, so we've talked about beating the heat. So let's talk about water conservation. So again, birds being super highly mobile, which is great, they can just fly to wherever the water is. And that's really great. And they can maybe detect it from the air and get to it. So that's just a key thing never to forget is the mobility of birds. So humans, like other mammals, when we need to excrete toxic nitrogenous wastes, we produce urine. And urine, you may have noticed, is basically water. There's a lot of water involved with the excretion of urea, which is our form of nitrogenous waste. Well, birds do something different. In order to conserve water, and this is true for all birds, so they're kind of pre-adapted to life in the desert this way, but they produce something called urea. So that's the nitrogenous waste produced by birds, and that uses much less water. They don't have to flush their system out with as much water, so they can keep that water in their tissues rather than using it just to basically flush things out. So that form is uric acid, and that is the white stuff. You see bird poop, the white part, that's the uric acid. And birds also do what they can in other ways to reduce evaporation. So when I talked about gular fluttering earlier, that was intentional evaporation, right? Trying to cool down, because that's one way to cool down. The problem with that is that you're losing water. So it's a trade-off. Sometimes that's what you got to do to cool down. But in general, birds are trying to conserve water. So one of the ways they actually do that is by having their feathers. Their feathers provide good insulation, not only keeping them warm, but also keeping them from getting too hot, because it's just good insulation, but also preventing as much water from escaping through the skin. So that's another way to reduce evaporation. And then this is something, again, that we would do if we were out there in the desert. We'd be looking for anything that has lots of water in its flesh. So we'd be looking for animals and plants that have a lot of water, that are sequestering that water. Plant tissues, for example, or like berries can have a lot of water, or like a juicy grasshopper or a grub or something that might be a good option. So actually, let me go back here and we're going to switch once again. So let's talk about some birds getting water. So this is the Namaqua sand grouse. And these birds this is a really great group of birds. First of all, they're just beautiful. And one of the cool things they do is that they basically every day during the breeding season, the males especially will fly many miles, maybe 20 miles away from where the nest is to where the water is. And they soak up water in their breast feathers and belly feathers that are especially adapted to be super absorbent. And they can actually take a couple ounces of water in their feathers back to the chicks. The chicks actually drink the water from the feathers. And that's how this species has solved the problem of being able to live in the desert, but still have access to water. So that's pretty remarkable. That's the Namaqua sand grouse. Now, this is bird poop. Actually, I wanted to spare you having to look at bird poop. This is actually a caterpillar. This is a giant, I want to say tiger moth caterpillar. I can't remember the exact species, but it's basically a caterpillar that is mimicking bird poop to avoid being eaten by birds, probably, because birds probably don't go around eating bird poop in general. So that's a pretty clever little trick. And if this were bird poop, the white stuff would be the uric acid, which again is the nitrogenous waste of birds that is different than what we have. So anyway, just kind of cool little biology thing there. Then we have this beautiful black-throated sparrow. This is a North American species that is one of our really well-adapted desert birds. And I say that because it thrives in desert environments. And one of the ways it can do that is by being able to survive for weeks, possibly indefinitely, without having to drink actual water. They get all the moisture they need, all the water they need from what they eat primarily. And that is really amazing. Now, when ornithologists have studied these birds in the lab, as I recall, the birds will happily drink water when it's available. It's just that they don't need to have water. So their physiology is adapted such that they can survive long periods of time without water. But opportunistically, if there's a rainfall, for example, and a little puddle forms, these guys, they're not going to shun the water. They're going to drink it, but they just don't need it as much as most other birds. And that goes the same for Gambel's quail, a really beautiful denizen of our deserts. Gambel's quail, too, can survive for long periods of time, again, if not indefinitely, without drinking water. And one of the things these birds do is they create something, or they make use of something called metabolic water. So when you or I or birds break down our food, we go through cellular respiration, this microscopic process, molecular process, where we're breaking that food down, we're creating energy from it, but one of the byproducts is actually water, H2O. And here's the formula. If you like this kind of thing, it's kind of scared me when I put it up there because it gave me bad vibes from when I was in chemistry many, many years ago. But so you've got your carbohydrate there on the left, and you've got oxygen, and those go through this process of cellular respiration, the byproducts being carbon dioxide. That's why you breathe out carbon dioxide. And then there's some water that's also a byproduct. And then, of course, energy, right? That's what we're doing. We're getting energy from our food. Birds are getting energy from their food. So these desert birds, they make use of that so-called metabolic water. They don't just, get rid of it. They actually incorporate it into their tissues. And so they're actually being able to make use of that, which is not something that humans do, for example. But there are other desert-dwelling animals, like some kangaroo rats and desert-dwelling mammals, that can do this. They've evolved to make use of that metabolic water. So just really neat. And there's the H2O. I just wanted to highlight that. So another thing is, again, we talked about is the reduction of water loss through the skin. So here is a greater hoopoe lark bopping around in probably the Sahara Desert or maybe the Arabian Peninsula. And ornithologists have studied these desert larks, not just this species, but other desert-dwelling larks, and there are a handful of them, and they're found in the deepest parts of the Sahara. These birds, compared to larks living in places like Europe that are more mild and have lots more precipitation, the desert larks have special fats in their skin that prevent water loss through the skin. So they're actually specially adapted to minimize evaporation compared to their close relatives that live in places where there's plenty of green vegetation and plenty of rainfall. So that's just another really cool adaptation that ornithologists have discovered. And I mentioned that you could also choose to survive by eating food that has a lot of moisture in it. So here again is the phainopepla. We've got a nice male phainopepla, and he's hanging out with some mistletoe. Mistletoe is a parasitic plant. It's widespread in the desert. There are different species, but you may know that phainopeplas are specialists in eating mistletoe. They have a symbiotic relationship with the plant. They eat the berries, they poop the seeds out on a bush somewhere else, and those seeds germinate, and then they infect that plant. So that's how the parasitic mistletoe spreads around. One of the ways they do that is through dispersal by phainopeplas. So you see there on the upper left, that's the mistletoe berry zoomed in. And so those berries, like many berries, have a lot of moisture in them. So the phainopepla lives in very harsh environments and in part can survive by eating these berries that have lots of moisture. Okay, back to this one. So again, with food, finding food, you can fly to find food, and that's just kind of given. Now, one way to also deal with the limited food is don't be picky. Just eat everything you come across in the desert, right? If you're super specialized on one thing, that's great. Hopefully there's a lot of that thing. But if you're able to be an omnivore and you can eat many different resources from seeds to insects and scorpions and lizards and small mammals and birds and snakes and everything under the sun, maybe even a little bit of carrion, then you might be a roadrunner because that's what roadrunners do. They are really great omnivorous birds. They eat many things, and that is one of the things that allows them to live in many desert environments. Some birds cache food, so being able to tuck some extra food away here and there, whether it's seeds or a lizard, like if you're a shrike, you know how shrikes hang dead lizards and dead birds and things around and they cache food. So that's one strategy. And then also another way of dealing with the food shortage, the general food shortage, is because you need a lot of extra food in the breeding season to feed not just yourself, but your babies. Maybe you should breed during the time of the year in the desert when food is at its maximum, when it's most available, right? There's never that much, but there's probably a season where there's a little bit more rain, temperatures are a little more mild, the plants are producing green vegetation, fruits, whatever. There are more insects. So that's what many birds do is they breed during the time of year when resources are at their maximum. And then, of course, just conserve energy. Because if there's not a lot of food, why do you need food? You need it for energy. But if you're not using a lot of energy, you don't need as much food. So birds in general have high metabolisms and they have high body temperatures, as we talked about. But some of these desert dwelling birds have lower metabolisms. Like, remember the greater hoopoe lark, the one in the sand dunes I just showed you. Those desert dwelling larks do apparently have lower metabolisms than their close relatives living in Europe. So, and you can also just behaviorally conserve energy, right? Just only move when you have to, only move at the cooler times of day, all of the stuff we've been talking about. An interesting physiological and behavioral adaptation is going into torpor. So some small birds do this. You may have heard that hummingbirds do this. Many hummingbirds do this, where they greatly lower their body temperatures and their metabolisms at night when they're sleeping. And in the case of hummingbirds, it's because they require so much energy to do what they do that if they just didn't lower their metabolisms at night, they might actually starve because they're just burning so many calories every minute, every hour. So that's one reason for torpor. But some other birds do this as just a way to conserve energy when either it's really cold or there's just not a lot of food. And so a great example of that would be the common poorwill. And this is a North American species, and it's somewhat migratory in some places, but there's also resident birds in the south, kind of in the desert southwest. And this bird actually goes into what we would maybe call hibernation because it lowers its body temperature sometimes as low as like 5 degrees Celsius. So significantly lower than normal. Normal, it would be 30 something Celsius. And these birds just kind of tuck into some rocks, and throughout the winter, when the temperatures are cold and there's not really that much food because these are insect-eating birds, they just kind of hunker down and go into this almost like suspended animation, like hibernation. So that's how they're conserving energy. They can stay in the desert and deal with the limited resources because they're just basically shutting the whole system down. Okay, so just a little bit about conservation. We should always be thinking about this. I know you guys obviously think about this a lot with your organization, which is great. So deserts are interesting. Every ecosystem on Earth is threatened, of course, some more than others. And I'm not an expert in deserts. We're just having a fun conversation here. I am very interested in them. But one thing that I believe is possibly true is that because deserts are so inhospitable to humans in general, they have, in some places, suffered less from human shenanigans than other environments. Environments like grasslands or wetlands or the coastal areas. I mean, those are places that people want to live, where they want to grow their crops, things like that. And so those have been hit really hard. Now, people are living in the desert and have for millions of years, certainly many thousands of years. But I think a lot of desert environments are somewhat still undisturbed relative to many other environments. Now, does that mean that they're not in trouble? Absolutely not. And desert birds are definitely in trouble as well. So it's just something interesting, is that these harsh environments, because humans aren't as attracted to them, they've been left alone a little more than some of the other environments. But nevertheless, there's been plenty of habitat degradation, and that comes in many forms. Some of that is from off-road vehicles, from grazing, from invasive plants. So things like these invasive grasses that burn very easily, and then they kill other vegetation that's native. There's, of course, development. When you look at places like Phoenix, Arizona, or Las Vegas, or some of these huge communities that are in desert environments that really aren't set up to support that much biomass, right? Then there's renewable energy development like solar and wind and dams on the few desert rivers there are. So there's a lot of encroachment on deserts, and there has been a lot of habitat degradation. One real problem for deserts is that they don't recover quickly. So unlike, let's say, a tropical rainforest or maybe even a grassland that might be able to bounce back given enough space and time, might be able to bounce back and recover a lot of the biodiversity. Deserts, because they have so few species and so little biomass, and it's so harsh, it can take decades or hundreds of years to recover what was lost when a bunch of motorcycles go ripping across the desert and killing a bunch of plants. And there's also special organisms that live in the soil. You may have heard of cryptobiotic soil. Those get destroyed and they take thousands of years to develop. So deserts are fragile in many ways, even though they don't appear to be, because they don't recover quickly in many cases. In terms of desert birds and their conservation, the challenge for them might be that they are so well adapted to these harsh environments that for an animal of their size, they might be living on the edge already in terms of what is physiologically possible on this planet. If things were to get more dramatically harsh, hotter, for example, it might be that, yeah, birds are good at living in heat, better than most birds, but it just might not be possible for them to adapt any further. So it doesn't, just because it's hotter doesn't mean like the desert birds are going to rejoice and spread around the world, And then, of course, this leads us to think about climate change, because as things warm up in many parts of the world, in some places they're drying out. So if you look at the desert Southwest, there's this, these many years of drought have been going on, and that changes the vegetation communities, and that changes the whole ecosystem in terms of the birds and everything. So it's real, it's happening, and it's affecting birds dramatically. For example, there was a study published in 2018 in the journal PNAS, I can't remember, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. That study looked back at 100 years of data of bird surveys in the Mojave Desert. And there were 50 sites across the desert. This is all in California. And so they looked at the birds from 100 years ago through these surveys up to 2018 or whatever it was. And they found that in those sites across the Mojave, 43% of the bird species in those locations had disappeared. So the diversity went down by 43% in 100 years, which is ridiculous. It's super dramatic. It's devastating. And what the biologists concluded was, or they guess, is that the primary culprit for that loss is the decrease in precipitation over that time, over 100 years, basically the climate change. Now, there may be some natural forces at work there, hard to say. Climate change may be more just like the last 30, 40, 50 years, who knows? But in any case, there's been a long-term decrease in precipitation, and that seems to be strongly correlated with this loss in bird diversity. So it's been going on, and it continues to go on. You may have seen the recently published State of the Birds report put out by many bird conservation organizations. And they looked at these trends in bird populations. So not so species, but also in actual numbers of birds across North America. And they found that when they looked at arid land birds, right? So that's all the birds we're talking about today, including some that live outside of deserts, but in still fairly dry places, that these guys are not doing well. In fact, there's the 41% of them, there's been a 41% loss in those birds in terms of their populations since 1970. And at present, we have 17 species of those that have been looked at that are declining, so their populations are going down, and 14% of them have stable populations. And importantly, I don't know if you can see it there, but it says there are no increasing species. So no arid land bird species that have been studied have increasing populations. And there are other birds out there, native birds, that have increasing populations. And not a lot. I mean, this is a pretty dire report across the board, but arid land birds are significantly suffering. So they need a lot of help. They need our help for sure. So I'll just read this. This is from the State of the Birds. It says, since 1968, the West has lost almost half, 46% of arid land habitat from pressures such as drought, wildfires, and invasive plants. Renewable energy development adds to these pressures, which collectively contribute to widespread declines for birds such as sagebrush sparrow and cactus wren. So, yeah, that's pretty dire. But there's always hope, right? And this is why we're all gathering here this evening. You guys have a wonderful organization. You know, I'm doing what I can to try to communicate the love for birds and get more people excited about birds and conservation. And so there's always reason to be hopeful that things will turn around. So, you know, as we think about deserts, they're just, I think, by many people underappreciated. And that can be nice, you know, if you want to go birding in the desert and you get out there and you're the only one out there because nobody else wants to be out there. That can be pleasant. But many people like myself are big fans of desert environments. They are, I think, stunningly beautiful, fascinating places full of very interesting birds and other types of wildlife and plants. Fascinating geology that you can actually see because the landscape is bare and not covered by forest. So these are wonderful environments. And so if you haven't spent a ton of time birding in the deserts, I can highly recommend it. There are definitely places that you might go where you see hardly anything for an entire day. Other places you go and can be really just popping with birds. The Sonoran Desert at the right time of year in southeastern Arizona is one of my favorite places in the world. Saguaro National Park, for example, or the areas of the Sky Islands, all of that. There can be a really rich diversity of birds. So I hope you have already enjoyed the deserts, or that you're inspired to do so after listening to this. And I will just give one last little plug for my podcast. If you don't know, I have the podcast, The Science of Birds. As Jessica was telling you, I've been doing this for almost 5 years now, which is hard to believe. It's become my greatest passion in my life. I've got many thousands of people enjoying the show. I've got 114 episodes or something like that now, and it's an absolute joy, and I get a lot of great feedback. So yeah, so check that out if you haven't. And with that, I thank you all, and I am done with the talk. I see. Yeah, thank you. I see everybody. Nice.
Yeah. Do we have questions? Oh, I do see that there's 10 things in the chat already. Half of them are complaining about the beginning of this.
Right.
Oh, somebody says, I have a question to everyone. Oh, well, I mean, we're here. I clean out my bluebird box before this spring. What do y'all do? No one has a clue, Susan. I cleaned mine out. I'll report back to you. Okay.
They should be cleaned out by now, and soon you'll be tracking them.
Thank you, Melanie. I knew someone had to know. Okay. Yep, lots of complaints about the beginning. Oh, great. Nothing online. No chat. No questions in the chat. Back to questions. Do you guys? Yes, Mary. I'll repeat for you internet people.
Sure.
What about flightless birds? They can't fly anywhere.
Yeah, that is a good point. Well, as we talked about, flying away and escaping the worst of the desert is just one strategy, right? There are many birds that again are obligate desert birds that live there year round, and they have to rely on these other adaptations, right? They're the way that they structure their daily behaviors. They have maybe special physiology, things like that. Now, I haven't done a survey of this or anything, but I have to wonder if proportionally there might be fewer flightless birds in desert environments. I mean, I did mention the lesser rhea, which is the large ratite of South America, ostrich-like bird. Those do live in dry environments, but yeah, most flightless birds live in environments that are a little milder, I would say.
That's a good point though, because ostrich, rhea, emu, I think of this kind of habitat. And then there's New Zealand. That's just bets are off.
Yeah. These large the ratites, the paleognats, they're interesting because large body size might be part of it, and sometimes you don't heat up as fast when you're large, so you retain your body temperature a little easier, and they do have, and they're really ancient birds as well, and so I'm just guessing here. I can't say for sure, but they might have relatively slow metabolisms. That might help as well. So yeah, I'm sure they have. I mean, it obviously works. They do it, so it's just a question of how.
Yeah, is there a bird on your shirt?
That's a good question. Well, I do have my Joshua Tree National Park shirt on. There's a bird. Yeah, there's one. Yeah, it's like a hawk. It's probably a hawk.
That
But
was
he's
my
out of there. He's flying away from the desert. He's out of there.
Linda, yes. Trying to fly and find water would use a lot of energy. I guess in turn you would need an adaptation to eat more, get more energy. Like there's a trade-off there for sure. How do they, oh, that's an even better question. How do they find the water in the first place?
Yeah, really good question. I mean, I've often wondered that myself. I think with birds are generally visual, right? They're going to rely primarily on their eyesight. So there'd be many cues to find water. Imagine you're flying really high in the air. I mean, what would you look for? Obviously, you could just look for water reflecting the sun, but you could also look for vegetation, right? That would be a key thing. If you've lived in this environment for millions of years, you would probably have a very strong search image for where the water is. And even you or I, if you were stuck in the desert and you saw a little patch of green in the distance, that's probably where you would head, right? Maybe there'd be some cottonwood trees there, maybe a little creek or something. So yeah, so it is interesting to think about though, with mammals, there might be other things involved. They might actually be able to smell some of the vegetation or smell the water itself. Who knows? But with birds, I think it would probably be visual.
I wonder how often they might remember. Like those, was it grouse that soaked their feathers? I wonder if they learn from each other, follow each other.
Yeah, I mean that seems likely. I mean they're not going to know. They're not going to know on their own. They're going to have to remember where to go. So and they do this in flocks. It is true. Yeah. So certainly follow each other.
More questions? Tally has a comment. Tally, come show him what your face looks like.
Hi, Ivan.
Hi, Tally.
Thank you so much for being so awesome. I just wanted to say thank you for agreeing to speak to our group. And I also wanted to let you know that we have some big fans in the audience. So they were very excited that you
Oh,
agreed.
nice.
Tonight. So
Nice.
thank
Well,
you so much.
yeah, that's awesome. Thank you, Tally. No, it's great. Yeah. Um, no, it's really cool. I honestly, with this podcast thing, it's just kind of ridiculous. Like, I started it just because I didn't know what to do during the pandemic, because normally I'd be leading tours. It's like, what do I do now? So I started the podcast, and yeah, it's been wonderful. And you know, I've met some people, fans of the podcast, even in other parts of the world and stuff. So it's always so cool to meet people. It just feels bizarre, but it's just fun to talk about birds, you know. And I learn a lot through what I'm doing. I mean, to me, it's just a wonderful way to learn, because when you, as you know, when you teach something, it's the best way to learn.
Great.
It's some good
Do you
faces
have-
there, Jessica.
Do you have a most favorite desert bird and also a most memorable desert bird?
Well, you know, I mean, maybe this is predictable, but well, two. So the Roadrunner, and I've talked about this in the podcast a little bit. So the Roadrunner goes back to when I was in elementary school. I didn't live in a desert, but I lived in a relatively aridish environment in Southern California, and our mascot was the Roadrunner, and they had a contest for making a new logo for the Roadrunner, and I was kind of a drawing kid, so I decided I'm going to win this thing. So I submitted like 20 different designs, and then they picked one of them, and yay, you know, so went on the t-shirt and everything. So the funny thing is, I'd never seen a Roadrunner in the flesh at that point. And I only saw one like in my town like 20 years later as an adult, but they were there apparently. So the Roadrunners, I think, is just amazing. It's you know, in the cuckoo family, and it's just the weirdest, craziest bird, and they're beautiful and charismatic and just so cool. So that would be probably the top, certainly North American bird. And then the cactus wren. I love the cactus wren. Did some research on them as an undergraduate many years ago. Just such a great bird. So those would be the two, I think.
The good ones. Last call. Okay, great. Yay!
Yay! We did it. Thanks, guys. Great to see you.
Thank you, Ivan.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Do I just click away from him? What do I do?
Click away, click away. All right. All right. Good night, guys. Thank you. Bye-bye.